Mr. Carter, what happened to you? Why are you lying here? William Carter opened his eyes slowly. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. Above him was not a ceiling, just a pale gray morning sky. Then he remembered. He turned his head slightly and saw a little girl standing outside the driver's side window, looking at him with wide, curious eyes. William frowned slightly, confused. His voice was rough from sleep and cold air. You know who I am? The little girl nodded. You're Mr. Carter. He slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position, wincing as his muscles protested. I'm sorry, he said gently. Who are you? How do you recognize me? My name is Annie, she said. My mom used to work for you. William stared at her for a moment, then nodded slowly. Your mom worked for me. What was her name? Margaret, Annie said. She worked in accounting. On the 4th floor, William sighed. Margaret, yes, she was very good at her job, very careful. She caught a reporting mistake once that saved us a lot of money. He paused, eyes distant. She was one of the best people in that department. Annie smiled a little. She always said you were a good boss. William gave a small, tired smile. I tried to be. Then the smile faded. But after I lost the company, after I went bankrupt, everyone left. Employees, partners, friends. He swallowed. Even my own family. When the money disappeared, so did the people. As he spoke, a sharp pain twisted in his stomach. He stopped mid-sentence and pressed his hand lightly against his abdomen without thinking. The hunger came in waves now, deep and hollow, like something inside him was folding in on itself. He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Annie noticed immediately. Are you hungry, Mr. Carter? She asked quietly. William tried to smile, but it came out weak. I'm okay. Right then, his stomach growled loudly in the small silence between them. William closed his eyes for a brief second. Embarrassed. Once, he had eaten in restaurants where dinner cost more than most people's monthly rent. Now he couldn't even hide the sound of his own hunger. Annie didn't laugh. She didn't look surprised. She simply opened the paper bag she was holding. Inside was a small loaf of bread. She broke it carefully into 2 uneven pieces, then held the bigger half out to him. My mom says when someone is hungry, you share, Annie said. You don't ask questions first. William looked at the bread in her hand. For a second, pride told him to refuse. Pride was the last thing he had left. Then his stomach twisted again, stronger this time. He reached out slowly and took the bread. Thank you, he said, his voice quieter than before. He took a bite, then another, then another. He hadn't realized how hungry he was until that moment. The bread was simple, a little dry, probably from yesterday, but to him, it tasted better than any expensive meal he could remember. He ate faster than he meant to, the hunger taking over, each bite disappearing almost as soon as he swallowed it. Within a minute, the half loaf was gone. He stopped suddenly, looking down at his empty hands, a little ashamed at how quickly he had eaten. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't mean to, I was just hungry, Annie said simply, finishing her smaller piece slowly. It's okay. They sat in silence for a moment. My mom lost her job too when the company closed, Annie said softly. She cried that night. She thought I didn't hear, but I did. William looked down at the steering wheel. I'm sorry, he said again. And this time, the words felt heavier. But she said it wasn't your fault, Annie continued. She said sometimes good people get pushed out by bad people with better lawyers. William let out a quiet breath. Your mom is a smart woman. She found another job, Annie said. She cleans rooms at a hotel now, at night. She sleeps in the morning. Sometimes she watches the news on her phone to see if there's any news about you. She said you disappeared. She was worried something bad happened to you. William looked around the car, at the blanket, the box of books, the wrinkled jacket. Something bad did happen, he said quietly. I lost everything. Annie looked at him for a long moment, then asked, Are you going to stay in your car again tonight? I don't know, William answered honestly. Annie thought for a few seconds, then said, You can come to our house. William shook his head gently. No, Annie. I can't do that. Why not? Because I don't want to be a problem for your mom. I've already caused enough problems for enough people. Annie frowned and looked at him very seriously. You helped my mom once. I don't remember helping that much, William said. She said I was in the hospital, Annie replied. And you told the company to keep paying her so she wouldn't lose our apartment. That was a long time ago, he said quietly. Annie shook her head. My mom says kindness doesn't expire. William didn't know what to say to that. Annie adjusted her backpack on her shoulders and looked at him with the calm seriousness that only children sometimes have. So now, she said, you helped my mom before. Now we help you. That's fair. William was silent. After he finished the bread and the tight knot in his stomach finally loosened, he thanked her again and told her he needed time to think. Annie didn't argue like a child. She just nodded like a small adult who understood that some decisions were heavy. My house is 3 streets that way, she said, pointing past the church and down a row of small brick buildings. White door, number 118. If you change your mind. William nodded. I have to go to school, the little girl said. But I'll come back here. William nodded again. Thank you for the bread. Then she walked toward the sidewalk. After a few steps, she turned around and waved at him like this was the most normal meeting in the world. William sat in the car for a long time after she left. William looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He barely recognized the man looking back at him. His beard had grown uneven. There were dark circles under his eyes. The expensive haircut was gone, replaced by hair that fell wherever it wanted. His shirt was wrinkled. His jacket smelled like the inside of the car. Mr. Carter, he said quietly to his own reflection, as if testing the name. It sounded like someone else now. Someone from another life. Around noon, he drove his car out of the church parking lot and headed toward a part of the city he hadn't visited in years. The streets grew narrower, the buildings older, the stores smaller. Check cashing places, discount groceries, laundromats, small restaurants with handwritten signs in the windows. He stopped in front of a hardware store with a sign that read, Help Wanted, Part-Time. He sat in the car for a full 5 minutes before getting out. Inside, the store smelled like wood, metal, and dust. Shelves were packed with tools, nails, paint cans, and things he didn't even know the names of. Behind the counter stood an older man in a faded blue shirt, reading a newspaper. William walked up to the counter. I saw the sign outside, he said. About the job. The man looked up over his glasses and studied William for a long moment. You ever worked in a hardware store before? The man asked. William shook his head. No, sir. You know anything about tools, plumbing, paint, repairs? No, sir, he said again. But I learned fast, and I'll work hard. The old man folded his newspaper slowly. Everybody says that. William nodded. I know. The man studied him for another few seconds. You in some kind of trouble? He asked. You don't look like a man who usually walks into a place like this asking for a job. William thought about lying. It would have been easy. Say he moved here. Say he lost his previous job. Say anything simple and clean, but he was too tired to lie. I used to run a company, he said. I lost it. Now I need work. The old man didn't look surprised. He just nodded once, like he had heard many versions of that story before. What was the company? He asked. William hesitated again, then said, Carter Systems. The old man's eyebrows moved slightly. He lowered the newspaper completely now and looked at William much more carefully. I saw you on the news, he said. I figured you might have, William replied. The old man was quiet for a moment, then said, News says a lot of things. Some of them true. Some of them not. He pointed toward a stack of boxes near the back. You start by moving those into the storage room. We'll see if you still want the job after that. William nodded. Yes, sir. For the next 4 hours, William Carter carried boxes, swept floors, stocked shelves, and learned the names of tools he had never touched before. His hands, which had once signed contracts and typed on sleek keyboards, were soon covered in dust and small cuts from cardboard edges. His back hurt, his arms hurt, but sometime around the 3rd hour he realized something strange. No one in the store cared who he used to be. They only cared if he worked. At the end of the day, the old man handed him a small envelope with cash inside. Come back tomorrow, he said. If you want the job. William looked at the envelope in his hand. It wasn't much money. In his old life, he had probably spent more than this on coffee in a week. But this was the first money he had earned with his hands in a very long time. Thank you, he said. When he got back into his car that evening, he sat there with the envelope in his hands for a long time. Then he reached into the glove compartment and took out the old photo of the first Carter Systems team. 5 young people in a tiny office, smiling like the world was waiting for them. "We made it," he said quietly to the photo. "We really did." He paused, then added, "I just didn't know how to keep it." If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like this video. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about kindness, justice, and second chances. The sun was setting when he drove back toward the church. As he turned onto the street behind Michael's, he saw a small figure sitting on the church steps, swinging her legs and looking down the road like she was waiting for someone. Annie. She spotted his car immediately and stood up, waving both arms. William parked and got out of the car. "You came back," she said, smiling like she had never doubted it. "I told you I might," he replied. She looked at him carefully. "Did you eat today?" He nodded. "Yes, and I worked." Her eyes widened a little. "What kind of work?" "I carried boxes, swept floors, learned the difference between 10 kinds of screws," he said. Annie nodded like this was very impressive. "That's honest work. My mom says honest work makes you sleep better." William looked at the church behind her, then down the street she had pointed to that morning. 3 streets away. White door. Number 118. He took a slow breath. "Is your offer still open?" he asked. Annie smiled. "I told you. That's how it works. You helped us before. Now we help you." William Carter looked at the small girl standing in front of him, then at the quiet street, then at the dark interior of his car where he had slept alone for so many nights. For the first time since he lost everything, he felt something that felt a little like hope. "Okay," he said softly. "Take me to your house, Annie." William walked slower as they approached the house. The closer they got to the white door with the crooked number 118, the more he felt something unfamiliar creeping into his chest. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something closer to shame. In his old life, he had walked into glass towers, private clubs, luxury hotels, and boardrooms where people stood up when he entered. Now he was about to walk into the house of a former employee, with nowhere else to go. Annie pushed the door open like she had done this 1,000 times. "Mom, I'm home," she called out, stepping inside and dropping her backpack near the wall. William stopped at the doorway. He suddenly became very aware of his clothes, his unshaven face. The fact that everything he owned now was inside the old car parked down the street. He took a small step back, already preparing to leave. From the kitchen, a woman's voice called, "Annie, did you finish your—" Margaret walked into the hallway, drying her hands on a towel, and froze when she saw him standing at the door. For a moment, neither of them moved. "Mr. Carter?" she said, her voice full of surprise. William immediately stepped back another half step. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I just walked Annie home. I didn't mean to intrude. I was just leaving." He turned slightly, ready to go, but Margaret moved forward quickly. "Wait," she said. "Please don't go." William stopped. Margaret looked at him carefully, and the expression on her face was not anger, not blame, not resentment. It was something much simpler. She was happy to see him. "I saw the news," she said softly. "I heard what happened. I tried to find a way to contact you, but all the company emails were shut down and I didn't know how to reach you." She shook her head slightly. "I never thought I'd find you standing at my door." William didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to being welcomed anymore. "I don't want to cause trouble for you and Annie," he said. "You've already been through enough because of me. You lost your job when the company collapsed." Margaret's face became serious, and she stepped closer to him. "Mr. Carter," she said gently, "I didn't lose my job because of you. I lost my job because of what they did to you. There's a difference." Before William could answer, Annie ran into the hallway. "Mom," she said excitedly, "I found him at the church. He was sleeping in his car." "Annie," William said softly, a little embarrassed, but Annie kept talking, her words rushing out. "He was really hungry, so I gave him bread. And guess what? He worked today. He carried boxes and cleaned and everything." She looked back at her mother proudly. "Mom, we have to help him. You always say we help people when we can, and he helped us before. So now it's our turn." Margaret looked from Annie to William, and something in her eyes softened even more. "You found work today?" she asked. William nodded. "At a hardware store, just part-time work, carrying boxes, cleaning, nothing special." Margaret smiled gently. "Honest work is always special." Annie grabbed her mother's hand. "Mom, Can you help him find a better job? Maybe at the hotel? Or maybe you know someone. He's really smart. He used to build computer things, big ones. William looked down, a little uncomfortable. I don't know about big things anymore, he said quietly. Right now I just need any job that lets me stand on my own. Margaret studied his face for a long moment. She saw the exhaustion, the pride, the embarrassment, and something else too, something broken but not gone. You're not standing alone, she said. Not tonight. William looked up at her, not sure he had heard correctly. I'm sorry. We have a couch, Margaret said simply. It's not very comfortable. And Annie moves a lot when she sleeps, so sometimes she ends up there in the morning. But it's warm. And it's better than a car. William immediately shook his head. No, Margaret, I can't do that. Yes, you can, she said, her voice calm but firm. You once told a room full of employees that a company is like a family, and family takes care of each other when times are bad. I was in that room. I never forgot that. William stared at her, surprised that she remembered something he himself barely remembered saying. Annie tugged lightly on his sleeve. Please, Mr. Carter, she said. Our couch is small, but our house is nice, and Mom makes really good soup. William looked from Annie to Margaret, and then back out toward the street where his old car was parked in the dark. He had slept in that car for many nights. Telling himself it was temporary, telling himself he still had control, telling himself he didn't need anyone, but standing here, in the doorway of a small house where he was being invited in not because of his money, not because of his title, but simply because he was cold and tired and human, he felt the last piece of his pride slowly loosen its grip. I don't know how to repay you, he said quietly. Margaret shook her head. You don't repay kindness, she said. You pass it on. That's how it works. Annie nodded immediately. That's what I told him. Margaret stepped aside and opened the door wider. Come in, Mr. Carter, she said gently. You can tell me everything while you eat. William Carter stepped into the small house, and as the door closed behind him, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he was not completely alone in the world anymore. William stood awkwardly just inside the door, as if he were afraid that if he stepped too far in, someone might change their mind and ask him to leave. The house was small, but it was clean. Not the kind of clean that came from money, but the kind that came from effort. The floor was worn but swept, the furniture old but carefully maintained, and on the wall near the hallway hung a few framed drawings that were clearly Annie's bright houses, stick figure people, a big yellow sun in the corner. Take off your shoes, Annie said, already slipping out of hers. Mom says the floor stays clean longer if we don't bring the street inside. William looked down at his worn shoes and nodded. That's a good rule, he said quietly, removing them and placing them neatly by the door. Margaret disappeared into the kitchen. Sit down, she called. Dinner is almost ready. William walked slowly into the small living room. There was a couch with a blanket folded over one side, a small table with a lamp, and a television that looked at least 10 years old. Everything in the room looked like it had been used for a long time, but also like it had been taken care of. Nothing was fancy, but nothing was neglected. Annie climbed onto the couch and patted the spot next to her. This is where you're going to sleep, she said very seriously. William smiled faintly. Then I should say thank you to the couch too. You can say thank you by not snoring, Annie replied. Margaret laughed softly from the kitchen. He can snore if he wants. This house has heard worse. A few minutes later, Margaret brought out 3 bowls of soup and placed them on the small table. Steam rose from the bowls, carrying the smell of vegetables, onions, and something warm and comforting that William could not name but immediately felt in his chest. They sat down together, and Annie folded her hands. We pray before dinner, she said, looking at William. He nodded respectfully and lowered his head. Thank you for the food, Annie said. Thank you for our house, and thank you for bringing Mr. Carter to our door so he doesn't have to sleep in his car anymore. Amen. Amen, Margaret said softly. William hesitated, then said quietly, Amen. They began to eat. The soup was simple, but it was hot and filling, and William forced himself to eat slowly this time, even though his body wanted him to finish the bowl in minutes. After a few bites, Margaret asked gently, What are you going to do now, Mr. Carter? He looked at his bowl for a moment before answering. I don't know yet. Right now I'm working at a hardware store, carrying boxes, cleaning, stocking shelves. It's not the life I planned, but it's work. Margaret nodded. Work is work. My father used to say a man who works with his hands sleeps better than a man who lies with his mouth. William gave a small smile. Your father sounds like a wise man. He didn't have much money, Margaret said. But he had a good name. Where I grew up, that mattered more. William was quiet for a moment. Then he said something he had not said out loud to anyone before. My name is the only thing I want back, he said. Not the company. Not the money. Just my name. Annie looked up from her soup. Then we get it back, she said simply. William looked at her, surprised by the certainty in her voice. It's not that easy, Annie shrugged. Most important things aren't easy. That's why they're important. Margaret looked at her daughter, then back at William. What really happened, Mr. Carter? She asked quietly. Not the news version. The real version. William leaned back slightly in his chair. For a long time, he had been silent because no one had asked him what really happened. They had only asked for statements, for lawyers, for signatures, for explanations that fit into headlines. So he told them about Andrew, his younger brother, the one he had trusted with the company's finances, because he believed family was safer than strangers. He told them how the shares were moved slowly, legally, quietly. How the board changed one vote at a time. How documents appeared with his signature on them that he had never signed. How the investigation started. How the board forced him to resign. How his accounts were frozen. How his wife packed her bags and left the same week. Margaret listened without interrupting. Annie listened too, even though there were parts she probably didn't fully understand. When you lose money, William said slowly, you think that's the worst thing that can happen, but it's not. The worst thing is watching people look at you like you're nothing, and realizing you can't prove that you're something. The room was quiet after he finished. Then Margaret said something very softly. I believe you. William looked up at her. Why? Because I worked in that accounting department, she said, and I remember numbers that didn't make sense. I asked questions once. My supervisor told me not to ask again if I wanted to keep my job. She paused. A few months later, everything collapsed. Now I think I understand why. William stared at her. You think Andrew planned this for a long time? Margaret nodded slowly. I think powerful people don't steal in one day. They steal in small pieces so no one notices until the house is already gone. Annie looked between them. Then we just have to show everyone the truth, she said. William almost smiled again. That's harder than it sounds. Margaret stood and began collecting the bowls. Maybe, she said, but you don't have to do it alone anymore. William sat there at the small table, in a small house, listening to a woman who had lost her job because his company collapsed, and a 6-year-old girl who had shared her bread with him that morning, and he realized something that hit him harder than losing the company. When he was rich, he had been surrounded by people but completely alone. Now he had nothing, and yet somehow, he was not alone at all. Later that night, Margaret brought him a pillow and a blanket and placed them on the couch. It's not much, she said. It's more than I deserve, William replied. She shook her head. Don't say that. Life already punished you enough. Now it's time to rebuild. Annie stood in the hallway in her pajamas. Good night, Mr. Carter, she said. Then she walked over and did something that surprised him again. She hugged him. It was a quick hug, the kind a child gives without thinking too much about it. Mom says people sleep better when they know someone is glad they're alive, Annie said. So, I'm glad you're alive. William felt his throat tighten, and for a second he could not speak. Good night, Annie, he said quietly. That night, William Carter slept on a small couch in a small house on a quiet street. The couch was too short, and he had to bend his knees. The refrigerator made a low humming sound in the kitchen. A car drove past every now and then. But it was warm, and for the first time in many nights, he did not feel like a man who had lost everything. He felt like a man who had been given one more chance. William woke up before everyone else. For a few seconds, he didn't remember where he was. He stared at the ceiling, confused by the unfamiliar room, the soft hum of a refrigerator, the faint sound of a car passing outside. Then he felt the blanket over him, the small couch under him, and slowly, the memories of the night before came back. The small house, the soup, Annie's hug, Margaret's quiet voice telling him he didn't have to rebuild alone. He sat up slowly, careful not to make noise. The blanket fell from his shoulders, and he folded it neatly, the way he had learned as a boy when his mother told him that a man should always leave a place a little better than he found it. The house was quiet. Early morning light slipped through the thin curtains, painting soft lines across the floor. On the small table, Annie's schoolbooks were stacked in a careful pile, with a pencil placed neatly on top, like she had prepared everything the night before. William stood and walked quietly into the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator slowly, then paused. There wasn't much inside. A carton of milk, a few eggs, a small container of leftovers, and a jar of peanut butter. He closed the refrigerator gently and stood there for a moment, thinking. Then he rolled up the sleeves of his shirt. When Margaret woke up an hour later, she walked into the kitchen and stopped in the doorway. William stood at the stove, carefully flipping something in a pan. "I hope you don't mind," he said when he saw her. "I found some eggs and bread. I thought I'd make breakfast." Margaret blinked in surprise. "Mr. Carter, you don't have to do that." He shook his head slightly. "Please. And call me William. I think I lost the right to be called Mr. Carter when I lost the company." Margaret leaned against the doorway watching him. "You didn't lose the right to your name," she said. "Only your title." He gave a small smile at that but didn't respond. Annie walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, still half asleep, her hair messy and her eyes barely open. She stopped when she saw William at the stove. "Are we rich again?" she asked. William laughed, a real laugh this time. "No, Annie, we are not rich again." "Then why are you cooking?" she asked. "Because your mom worked all night," William said. "And because I wanted to say thank you." Annie climbed onto a chair and watched him carefully. "You cook like you're doing math," she said. "What does that mean?" he asked. "You look very serious and you measure everything," she replied. Margaret smiled and sat down at the table. "My father used to cook like that too," she said. "He said if you cook carefully, people can taste the respect." They ate breakfast together, scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee for Margaret. It was a simple meal, but no one rushed. Annie talked about school, about a math test she wasn't worried about and a spelling test she was. Margaret talked about the hotel where she worked, about tourists who left their rooms messy and tourists who left thank you notes and tips. William mostly listened. He realized that for many years, he had only listened to people who wanted something from him. Investors, partners, reporters, lawyers. Conversations had always been negotiations, strategies, opportunities. This was different. This was just life. After breakfast, William stood and began collecting the plates. "You don't have to do that," Margaret said. "I know," he replied, "but I want to." As he washed the dishes, Annie came and stood next to him. "Mom says you're going to rebuild your life," she said. "I hope so," William replied. She looked up at him. "Then you should start with your name." He turned off the water and looked down at her. "What do you mean? You said yesterday you don't care about the company. You just want your name back," Annie said. "So we start with that. We prove you didn't do the bad things." William stared at her for a moment. "You make it sound very simple." Annie shrugged. "Simple is not the same as easy." He dried his hands slowly with a towel. "Even if I prove the truth, I may never get the company back. I may never get my old life back." Annie nodded like she understood something most adults didn't. "Maybe you don't need your old life," she said. "Maybe you need a new one." Those words stayed in William's mind long after Annie left for school and Margaret left for work. He spent that day back at the hardware store, carrying boxes, organizing shelves, helping customers find nails and paint, and things he was still learning the names of. His back hurt less today. His hands moved more confidently. When the old store owner handed him his pay at the end of the day, William thanked him and meant it. That evening, instead of driving back to the church parking lot, he drove back to the small white house with the crooked number 118. When he walked in, Annie ran to the door like she had been waiting. "You came back," she said, smiling. William nodded. "I told you I would." Margaret came out of the kitchen, still in her work uniform, looking tired but smiling. "How was work?" she asked. "Honest," William said. "Tiring, but honest." Margaret nodded. "That's a good kind of tired." They ate dinner together again that night. Nothing fancy. Rice, vegetables, a little chicken. Annie talked about school. Margaret talked about work. William talked a little about the hardware store. At one point, Annie looked at him and asked, "Were you happy before? When you were rich?" The question caught him off guard. He thought about the penthouse, the meetings, the flights, the deals, the expensive dinners, the awards, the interviews, the long nights at the office, the empty apartment. the quiet arguments with Sophia, the distance growing between him and his brother even before the betrayal. "I was busy," he said finally. "I thought being busy meant being important, and I thought being important meant being happy." He looked at Annie. "I was wrong." Margaret looked at him carefully but didn't say anything. Annie nodded slowly, like she was putting that information somewhere important in her mind. That night, as William lay on the couch again, staring at the ceiling in the dark, he realized something had changed inside him. He still had no company, no money, no reputation, no certainty about the future. But now, when he thought about tomorrow, he did not feel only fear. He also felt responsibility, not to a board of directors, not to investors, not to newspapers, but to a small girl who believed he could get his name back, and to a woman who had opened her door when he had nowhere else to go. For the first time since he lost everything, William Carter was not thinking about what he had lost. He was thinking about what he still had left to become. The next morning, William woke up before the alarm on Margaret's old kitchen clock rang. For a few seconds, he lay still on the couch, listening to the quiet breathing of the house. He could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator, the occasional car passing outside, and somewhere down the street, a dog barking once, and then going quiet again. He sat up slowly and rubbed his face with both hands. 6 days ago, he had still been fighting lawyers and board members. 6 days ago, he had still believed he could fix everything with one more meeting, one more deal, one more phone call. Now he was sleeping on a small couch in a small house, waking up early so he could get to a hardware store job on time. And strangely, this version of his life felt more honest than the last year of his old one. He stood, folded the blanket, and walked quietly into the kitchen. Margaret was already there, dressed for work, pouring coffee into a travel mug. "You wake up earlier than most men I know," she said. "I used to wake up early to check stock markets in Asia," William replied. "Now I wake up early so I don't lose a job that pays me by the hour." He gave a small smile. Life changes fast. Margaret leaned against the counter. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Regret what?" "Building all of it. The company, the money, the life you had." William thought about that for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "I regret who I trusted. I regret not seeing what was happening right in front of me. I regret choosing work over people too many times." He paused. "But I don't regret building something. Building something is still a good thing. I just built it with the wrong people." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then maybe this time you build with the right ones." Annie walked into the kitchen then, her hair still messy, holding a notebook. "I made a plan," she announced. William blinked. "You made a plan?" "Yes," Annie said, climbing onto the chair and opening the notebook. Inside were pages filled with large, careful handwriting and a few drawings. "Step 1. You keep working so we don't starve." Margaret covered her mouth, trying not to laugh. "Step 2, Annie continued. "We prove you didn't steal the money." William sat down across from her, suddenly very serious. "And how do we do that?" Annie turned the page. There were boxes drawn like a diagram. "Mom said you trusted your brother because he controlled the money, right?" William nodded slowly. "Yes. Andrew was the chief financial officer. All the financial reports went through his department. Then the bad numbers came from his computers," Annie said. "Not yours." William stared at the notebook. The drawing was simple, but the logic was not wrong. Margaret sat down too now. "I told you," she said quietly. "When I worked in accounting, I saw reports that didn't make sense, but I didn't have access to the main system. Only senior finance did." William felt something shift in his mind, like a door opening just a little. "If the original financial records still exist somewhere," he said slowly, "then the truth still exists somewhere too." Annie nodded like this was obvious. "So we find the truth." William leaned back in his chair. For the first time since the collapse, he wasn't just thinking about survival. He was thinking about fighting back. "I don't even have a computer anymore," he said. "Everything was frozen or taken." Margaret was quiet for a moment, then stood and walked into the living room. She came back holding an old laptop. The plastic was scratched, and one corner was taped. "It's slow," she said. "And sometimes it only works if you don't move it too much. But it connects to the internet." William took the laptop carefully, like someone handing him a tool instead of a machine. "This is more valuable than you think," he said. Annie smiled. "See? Step 3 already working. What's step 3? He asked. Step 3, Annie said, pointing at the notebook. We get your name back. William looked at the words written in large, uneven letters. Get his name back. He swallowed and nodded once. Okay, he said quietly. We try. That night, after dinner, William sat at the small table with the old laptop open. The internet was slow, and some keys stuck when he pressed them, but as he began typing, something inside him woke up again. Not the billionaire, not the CEO, the engineer, the builder, the man who used to write code late into the night because he loved solving problems. He started looking for old financial filings, archived reports, anything that still existed in public records. Companies that big left trails, legal documents, audit reports, transaction histories. After an hour, Annie fell asleep on the couch next to him, her notebook still in her hands. Margaret was washing dishes quietly in the kitchen. William stared at the screen, lines of numbers and reports reflecting in his tired eyes. They changed the timeline, he said suddenly. Margaret turned. What do you mean? These transactions they accused me of approving, William said, pointing at the screen. The timestamps don't match the board meeting records. According to this, I approved transfers on days I was in another state at conferences. There are photos, videos, public schedules that prove I wasn't even in the building. Margaret walked over and looked at the screen, though she didn't fully understand the documents. So it means someone used my authorization without me, William said. Or changed the records after. He leaned back slowly. Andrew, the name hung in the air like something heavy. Margaret looked at him carefully. If you prove this, what happens? William looked at Annie sleeping on the couch, her small hand still resting on the notebook with the words, "Get his name back" written across the page. If I prove this, he said quietly, I don't just get my name back. I expose what they did. All of it. Margaret nodded slowly. Then we keep going. William closed the laptop gently for the night. He looked around the small house, at the worn couch, the small kitchen, the drawings on the wall, the woman washing dishes, and the little girl sleeping with a notebook full of plans to save a man who used to be a billionaire. He realized something in that moment that no business book had ever taught him. The first company he built was made of money, contracts, and technology. The second life he was building now was made of people, and this time, he was going to protect it with everything he had. The next few days settled into a rhythm none of them had planned, but all of them slowly began to rely on. William worked during the day at the hardware store. In the evenings, he sat at the small table with Margaret's old laptop, going through documents, public records, archived financial statements, and anything else he could find. Annie did her homework next to him, sometimes asking him math questions, sometimes just sitting quietly and drawing while he worked. On Thursday evening, Annie looked up from her homework and asked, Mr. Carter, when you had your big company, did you ever fire people? The question caught him off guard. Yes, he said slowly. Sometimes I had to. Did you feel bad? She asked. William stared at the screen for a moment before answering. Sometimes. But I told myself it was business, that the company had to survive, and that sometimes decisions hurt people. Annie thought about this. My teacher says grown-ups use the word business when they don't want to say people get hurt. William leaned back in his chair and looked at her. Your teacher sounds like a dangerous person, Annie smiled. She is. She gives a lot of homework. Margaret laughed quietly from the kitchen, but William did not laugh. He was thinking about all the decisions he had made when he was CEO. Decisions that looked small on paper but changed someone's life somewhere else. That night, he found something. It was almost midnight. Annie had already fallen asleep on the couch, and Margaret was half asleep in the chair, waiting for him to finish so she could lock the doors and turn off the lights. Margaret, William said quietly. Come look at this. She stood and walked over, rubbing her eyes. What did you find? William pointed at the screen. These are internal transfer logs that were included in the court documents. Look at the authorization codes. Margaret leaned closer. I don't understand all these numbers. Each executive had a unique authorization pattern, William explained, like a digital fingerprint. These transfers that they said I approved, they carry my authorization ID. But the encryption pattern is slightly different. He tapped the screen. It's a copy, a very good copy, but still a copy. Margaret looked at him. You mean someone copied your authorization? William nodded slowly. Someone with very high-level access. Someone in finance. someone who knew exactly how the system worked. They both already knew the name, but neither of them said it for a few seconds. Finally, Margaret spoke quietly. "Your brother." William didn't answer right away. He just stared at the screen, at the lines of data that now looked less like numbers and more like a story. A story of planning, patience, and betrayal. "Do you know what the worst part is?" he said finally. Margaret shook her head. "He didn't just steal the company," William said. "He stole my name. He made the world believe I was the kind of man who would steal from his own company, from his own employees." His voice dropped. "That's what I want back. Not the building, not the money, just that." Margaret put a hand gently on his shoulder. "Then we keep going," she said. The next day at the hardware store, William worked like usual, but his mind was somewhere else. Every box he carried, every shelf he stocked, he kept thinking about the data, the authorization codes, the timeline. Around lunchtime, the old store owner walked up to him. "You look like a man doing math in his head while holding a hammer," the old man said. William smiled slightly. "Something like that." The old man leaned against the shelf next to him. "You know," he said, "I looked you up after you told me who you were." William stopped moving for a moment. And I saw a lot of news saying you were a thief," the old man said. "But I've been running this store for 40 years. I've learned something about people." "What's that?" William asked. The old man shrugged. "A real thief usually doesn't start over by carrying boxes for minimum wage when he used to be rich." William didn't know what to say to that. The old man continued, "Whatever happened to you, you just make sure you finish it. A man should finish his story himself, not let other people finish it for him." That sentence stayed with William the rest of the day. That evening, when he returned to the small white house, Annie was waiting at the table with her notebook open again. "Meeting," she said seriously. "Meeting?" William asked, taking off his jacket. "Yes," Annie said. "Step 4. "I don't remember step 4, he said. "I just made it today," she replied. She turned the notebook around so he could see. On the page, she had written in big letters, "Step 4. Tell the truth. To everyone." Margaret sat down at the table too. "How do we do that?" she asked. William sat across from Annie and looked at the notebook. "We need proof," he said. "Not just suspicions, not just logic. Real proof. Documents, original files, server logs. Something that shows the authorization was copied and used from another terminal." "Where is that?" Annie asked. William took a deep breath. "In the company servers." "In your company?" Annie asked. William shook his head slowly. "Not my company anymore. Andrew's company now." The room went quiet. Annie looked at him, then at the notebook, then back at him. "Then we go get it," she said. William almost smiled again. But this time there was something else in his expression too. Not just sadness. Not just exhaustion. Determination. "It won't be easy," he said. Annie nodded. "You said important things are not easy." Margaret looked between the two of them, then said quietly, "If you're going to do this, you need to be careful. People who steal companies don't like giving them back." William nodded. "I know." He looked at Annie's notebook again. Step 4. Tell the truth. To everyone. For the first time since he signed the papers in that glass conference room, William Carter felt like he was no longer just surviving. He was preparing to fight back. That night, after their meeting at the small kitchen table, William did not go to sleep right away. Annie had gone to bed, but her notebook was still on the table, open to the page that said in large, uneven letters, Step 4. Tell the truth to everyone. Margaret was washing dishes quietly, and William was sitting in front of the old laptop, staring at the screen but not really seeing it. His mind was somewhere else, somewhere between the past and whatever future he was trying to build now. "If I go back there," he said slowly, "they will know I'm looking for something." Margaret dried a plate and put it away. "Then don't go back as William Carter," she said. "Go back as someone else." He looked up at her. "Someone else?" "You said it yourself," she replied. "No one looks at you now and sees a billionaire. They see a man who carries boxes and fixes shelves. Maybe for the first time in your life, you can walk into a place and be invisible." William leaned back in his chair and thought about that. Invisible. He had spent his entire adult life being visible, being known, being watched, being important. Now invisibility might be the only thing that could save him. The next morning at the hardware store, he worked faster than usual. Not because the job was easier, but because his mind was clear. He had a direction now, not a perfect plan, but a direction. Around noon, the old store owner called him over. "William," he said, "I got a delivery going to a big office building tomorrow. They ordered a bunch of maintenance supplies. Light bulbs, extension cords, cleaning equipment. You want the job? It pays a little extra because it's a big order." "What building?" William asked. The old man checked the paper. "Carter Systems headquarters. Midtown." For a moment, William thought he had heard wrong. The words seemed to hang in the air. "Carter Systems?" he repeated. "Yeah," the old man said. "Big glass building. You probably know it." William looked down at the floor for a second, then back up. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know it. You want the job or not?" the old man asked. William nodded slowly. "Yes, I want it." That evening, when he told Margaret and Annie, Annie's eyes became wide. "That's like a movie," she said. "You get to go back into your own building like a secret agent." William smiled a little. "I don't feel like a secret agent." "You're going to be one," Annie said. "Step 5. "I don't remember step 5, Margaret said. Annie opened her notebook and wrote quickly, then turned it around. "Step 5. Go inside." Margaret looked at William, her expression more serious than Annie's. "You have to be careful," she said. "If your brother sees you..." "He won't," William said. "People like Andrew don't see people like the man I am now. That's the funny thing about power. When you have it, you think you see everything. But you don't see the people carrying boxes. You don't see the janitors. You don't see the delivery men." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then that's how you walk in. Carrying a box." That night, William could not sleep. He lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, remembering the building, the lobby with marble floors, the security desk, the elevators that required key cards, the long hallways of glass offices, the server room on the lower level where the financial system logs were stored and backed up. He knew that building better than anyone. He had designed half of it. The next morning, he put on his work clothes, jeans, boots, a plain shirt, and a cap the hardware store owner had given him. When he looked in the mirror, he did not see a billionaire. He saw a tired man who worked with his hands. Perfect, he thought. The delivery truck was old and noisy. The back was filled with boxes labeled with markers, light bulbs, cleaning supplies, cables, tools. As the truck drove into Midtown, the buildings grew taller, the streets cleaner, the people better dressed. It was like driving back into his old life, but from the outside. When the truck stopped in front of Carter Systems headquarters, William felt his hands tighten slightly. The glass building rose into the sky, shining in the morning light, exactly the way he remembered it. For a moment, memories hit him all at once. Opening day, the first big contract. The day he put his name on the building. Now his name was still on the building, but it no longer belonged to him. "You okay?" the driver asked. William nodded. "Yeah, let's unload." They carried the boxes through the service entrance in the back, not the main lobby, not the front doors where executives walked in, the service entrance where deliveries came in, the entrance William had probably walked past 100 times without ever using. Inside, a security guard looked up from a desk. He barely glanced at William, just signed the delivery form, and pointed down the hallway. Maintenance room. End of the hall. Left. Invisible, William thought. Just like Margaret said, he carried a box down the hallway, his heart beating a little faster now. Every corner of the building was familiar. The gray carpet, the white walls, the glass doors with department names printed on them. Finance department. He slowed slightly as he passed the glass wall. Inside, people sat at computers, talking, typing, drinking coffee. Normal life. The life that used to be his. He kept walking. At the end of the hall, he turned left, just like the guard had said. But instead of going straight into the maintenance room, he stopped in front of a gray door that looked like any other door. No sign, no label, just a keycard panel. The server room. He stood there for a moment, holding the box, listening to the sound of his own breathing. "Hey," a voice said behind him. "You lost?" William turned. A young employee stood there, holding a tablet. "Maintenance delivery," William said, lifting the box slightly. "They told me to bring this down here." Something about cables. The employee looked at the box, then at the door. Oh, yeah, they've been having connection issues. Hold on. He stepped forward, swiped his keycard, and opened the door. Just put it inside. William nodded. Thanks. He walked into the server room, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The room was cold, filled with the constant humming of machines. Rows of servers blinked with small green and blue lights, like a silent city of data. William Carter stood in the middle of the room he had designed, surrounded by the machines that held the truth that could give him his name back. He set the box down slowly. Then he walked toward the terminal on the wall, sat down, and placed his hands on the keyboard. For the first time since he lost everything, he was back where he knew exactly what to do. And this time, he wasn't here to build an empire. He was here to take his life back. William's fingers rested on the keyboard, but he didn't type immediately. The server room was cold, the kind of cold that came from machines that never slept. The air smelled faintly of metal and dust and electricity. Rows of servers blinked with small green and blue lights, steady and indifferent, like they didn't care who owned the company, who lost it, who stole it. They just stored the truth. William exhaled slowly and began to type. His hands moved carefully at first, then faster, as old habits returned. He didn't try to break into the system. He didn't need to. He had designed the system. He knew where the logs were stored, where the backups were hidden, where the automatic archives were sent every night at 2 a.m. to an off-site server that most executives didn't even know existed. Always build a system that tells the truth, even if people lie, he had once told his engineers. Now he was depending on the younger version of himself to have been a man who followed his own advice. He accessed the public terminal first, then navigated through layers of internal directories that looked boring and harmless to anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. Maintenance logs, system health reports, archive indexes. Then he found it. Financial authorization logs. Archive server backup. His heart began to beat faster, but his face stayed calm. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous moments in life were the ones where you had to look calm while everything inside you was moving. He copied the files he needed onto a small flash drive he had bought the night before with cash. The transfer bar moved slowly across the screen. 12%. 27%. 46%. Footsteps passed outside the server room door once, then again. Someone laughed in the hallway. A phone rang somewhere far away. 73%, 88%, 100%. He removed the flash drive, closed the windows, and placed the maintenance box back in his hands just as the door opened and the same young employee looked in. All good? The employee asked. William nodded. Yeah. Just left the cables there. Thanks, the employee said, already looking back down at his tablet. William walked out of the server room, down the hallway, past the finance department, past the offices, past the glass walls where people in suits talked and typed and lived the life that used to be his. No one stopped him. No one looked at him twice. No one recognized him. Invisible. When he stepped back out into the city air, he didn't realize how hard he had been holding his breath until he exhaled and felt his chest loosen. That evening, back at the small house, Annie and Margaret were waiting at the table when he walked in. Annie jumped up first. Did you go inside? She asked immediately. William closed the door behind him and nodded once. Yes. Annie's eyes widened. Step 5 complete, she said seriously. Margaret looked at his face carefully. Did you find anything? William reached into his pocket and placed the small flash drive on the table. It was nothing special, just a cheap plastic drive, but in that moment, it felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. The truth is in here, he said quietly. They didn't celebrate. They didn't cheer. The moment felt too serious for that. William sat down, opened the old laptop, and inserted the flash drive. The computer took a long time to recognize it, the screen flickering slightly, the fan making a tired humming sound. Finally, the files appeared. He opened the first log file. Lines and lines of timestamps, authorization IDs, terminal locations, encrypted signatures. Annie climbed onto the chair next to him, even though she couldn't understand most of what she was seeing. Margaret stood behind them, one hand resting on the back of the chair. William began to explain as he scrolled. Every time a large transfer was approved, the system recorded 3 things: the authorization ID, the terminal where the approval was made, and the encryption signature pattern. He opened another file and placed the 2 windows side by side. These, he said, pointing to the first column, are the transfers they said I approved, and this column here shows the terminal location. He zoomed in and pointed at a line. This one says the approval came from Terminal F, 214. Margaret frowned slightly. What does that mean? William looked at her. Terminal F, 214, is in the finance department. He paused. In my brother's department. He opened another log and cross-referenced the timestamps, then another, and another. Every large illegal transfer, every authorization using his ID, every time stamp, all from finance terminals, all from machines he never used, all from rooms controlled by Andrew Carter. William leaned back slowly, staring at the screen. This is it, he said quietly. This is the proof. Annie looked at the screen, then at him. So, we won? She asked. William shook his head gently. This is not the end. This is the beginning. Margaret nodded. Because now you have to show the world. William closed the laptop slowly. Andrew has lawyers, money, power. He controls the company, the board, the media statements. If I go to the police, it will become a long legal war. He looked at Annie, and people like him are very good at long wars. Annie thought for a moment, then opened her notebook and wrote something new. Step 6. Make it impossible for them to hide. She turned the notebook toward William. If one person hears the truth, they can hide it. If everyone hears the truth, they can't. William stared at the words. Margaret spoke softly. The shareholder meeting is next month. They broadcast it online every year. William looked at her. Yes, they do. Margaret continued. What happens if the truth appears there? In front of the board, the investors, the media, everyone. William felt something click into place in his mind. A plan. Risky. Dangerous. But possible. If the truth appears there, he said slowly, then Andrew doesn't just lose the company. He looked at Annie. He loses his name. Annie nodded. Like he tried to take yours. William looked at the small notebook, at the careful handwriting of a 6-year-old girl who had turned his life into a list of steps. Lose everything. Eat half a loaf of bread. Sleep on a stranger's couch. Carry boxes. Find the truth. Tell the truth. He realized something in that moment. When he was a billionaire, he had made plans worth millions of dollars. But the most important plan of his life was now written in pencil in a little girl's notebook. And he was going to follow it. William did not sleep much that night. After they discovered the server logs and Annie wrote, Step 6. Make it impossible for them to hide. Everything changed. The plan was no longer just an idea. Now it was a direction. And directions come with consequences. He sat at the small kitchen table long after Annie had fallen asleep, going through the files again and again, making copies, organizing timelines, matching terminal IDs with employee access records that were publicly available in old company reports. Margaret sat across from him with a cup of tea, not saying much, just being there so he wouldn't be alone. If you do this, Margaret said quietly, your brother will not forgive you. William didn't look up from the screen. He already destroyed me, he said. This is not about forgiveness anymore. This is about truth. Margaret nodded slowly. Then you need to be smarter than him. Not just right. Around midnight, William finally closed the laptop. The shareholder meeting, he said. It's in 2 weeks. They always stream it live for investors. And you can put the truth there? Margaret asked. So William nodded. If I can access the internal presentation system, I can override the media feed for a few minutes, long enough to show the logs, the terminal IDs, the authorization copies, long enough that it can't be erased before people record it. Margaret looked worried. Is that legal? William gave a small, tired smile.